Thomas Varga first saw the bear cub on a morning that should have been too cold for anything that small to still be alive. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, not gradually, not with warning. It had come down fast from the north, the kind of cold that didn't settle. It took. Water froze where it stood. Wood cracked under its own weight. Breath turned sharp in the lungs. Thomas had lived in Brannock Ridge long enough to recognize that kind of cold, and long enough to respect it. He was 48 years old, with hands that had grown thick from years of working land that didn't give much back. The cabin he lived in sat alone at the edge of a long stretch of forest, far enough from the village that most people only passed it if they had a reason. That morning, his reason was simple. Check the trap line. Make sure nothing had been caught and left overnight. Make sure nothing had been taken by something else. Winter didn't forgive carelessness, not in small things, not in anything. Thomas stepped out just after sunrise, though the light did little more than turn the snow from gray to pale white. The air hit him immediately, sharp, dry, final. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter across his chest, and started down the narrow path that led toward the trees. Each step pressed deep into the snow, fresh, untouched. No tracks. That was the first thing he noticed. Nothing had moved through the night, not deer, not fox, not even the smaller things that usually left restless patterns near the tree line. "Too cold," he muttered. The words came out stiff in the air, the kind of cold that quiets everything, the kind that makes the forest feel paused. Thomas walked slowly, not because he needed to, because rushing in weather like this led to mistakes, and mistakes in weather like this didn't get corrected. They ended. The first trap was empty, the second too. At the third, he stopped longer than usual. Not because something had been caught, because something had been there. Tracks, small, light, not older than a few hours. Thomas crouched, brushing snow aside with the back of his glove. The shape became clearer, rounder than a fox, too wide for a dog. He frowned. "Bear," he said quietly. The word didn't sit right, not this time of year. Bears should have been deep into denning by now, hidden, still, sleeping through the worst of it, not walking, not leaving tracks, and certainly not this small. Thomas stood slowly, his eyes moving outward, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the same stillness, the same quiet. He should have turned back then. That would have been the sensible thing. Something was wrong. And wrong things in winter were rarely simple. But Thomas had never been a man who turned back from uncertainty, only from certainty, and this wasn't clear yet. He followed the tracks, not quickly, not directly, just enough to understand where they went. They moved unevenly, not in a straight line, not confidently. There were gaps where the animal had stumbled, places where the snow had been disturbed more heavily, struggle, weakness, something that hadn't lasted the night well. Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. "A cub," he said. That made it worse. A cub alone meant something had already gone wrong, because cubs were not alone in winter, not above ground. Not unless something had separated them from what kept them alive. He continued forward, slower now, more aware, because a cub meant a mother, and a mother bear did not leave space for mistakes. The tracks led toward a shallow dip between two low ridges where the wind had pushed snow into deeper drifts. Thomas stepped carefully, testing each patch before shifting his full weight. The cold had hardened everything beneath the surface. One wrong step. He didn't finish the thought, didn't need to. He saw it before he heard it, a small shape against the snow, still, Too still. For a moment he thought it was already over, that whatever had happened here had finished before he arrived. Then, a movement, barely there. Thomas stopped. The world narrowed slightly. Just that space, just that shape. "Well," he said under his breath, "there you are." The cub lay curled in on itself, its fur stiff with frost, its body half sunk into the snow as if it had tried to bury itself against the cold and failed. It didn't lift its head, didn't react, only that faint movement beneath its side, breathing, still, but fading. Thomas stepped closer, slow, measured. His eyes scanned the surrounding area, trees, snow, nothing else. No sign of the mother, no larger tracks, no disturbance that suggested a struggle nearby. That didn't make it better. It made it worse. "Where'd you come from?" he murmured. The cub made a sound, soft, not quite a cry, more like something caught between breath and effort. Thomas crouched, carefully, not reaching yet, just observing. The cub's body was too small for this cold, too exposed. Its fur was thin in places, its movements slow, delayed. "Shouldn't be out here," he said. The words held no judgment, just fact. The cub shifted slightly, its head lifted a fraction, and for the first time, it looked at him, not with fear, not with recognition, just need. Thomas felt something settle in his chest, not sudden, not sharp, something older, something that had been there long before this moment. "This is where I leave you," he said quietly, because it needed to be said, because it was true. This was not his problem, not his responsibility, not something he had any reason to involve himself in. Nature handled its own, always had, always would. Interfering, he knew what that meant. Risk, cost, consequences that didn't end cleanly. Thomas exhaled slowly. The air burned slightly as it left his lungs. The cub made another sound, weaker this time. Its head dropped back into the snow. Thomas watched it for a long moment, long enough for the silence to settle fully, long enough for the decision to form, not as a question, as something already answered. "Damn it," he muttered. He removed one glove. The cold hit immediately, sharp, unforgiving. He ignored it, reached forward. Slowly, carefully, his hand hovered just above the cub's fur, waiting. There was no reaction, no movement, nothing left in it to resist. Thomas closed the distance, his fingers pressed into the fur, cold, stiff, but beneath it, faint warmth, barely there. "Still holding," he said, more to himself than anything else. He adjusted his grip, sliding one hand beneath the cub's body. It was lighter than he expected. Too light, the kind of light that spoke of something already slipping. Thomas lifted it. The cub didn't fight, didn't react. It barely moved at all. He brought it closer to his chest, tucking it inside his coat, using his body to shield it from the wind. The small weight settled there, fragile, uncertain, alive, for now. Thomas stood slowly. His joints protested slightly in the cold, but he ignored that too. There were other things to consider now. Distance, time, what came next. He looked once more toward the trees. Still nothing. No sign of the mother. No sign of anything that explained why the cub had been left like this. That absence stayed with him. He didn't like it, didn't trust it. But he didn't have the luxury of solving it now. Not if the cub was going to survive the next hour. Thomas adjusted his coat, securing the opening to trap what little warmth he had. "All right," he said, "we'll see what you've got left." He turned back toward the path. The walk felt longer this time, heavier, not from the cub, from what came with it. Each step carried a quiet understanding. This was not something that ended when he reached the cabin. This was the beginning of something else, something he hadn't planned, something he hadn't wanted, but something he had already chosen. Halfway back the cub stirred, slight, weak, a small shift against his chest. Tomas paused, adjusted his hold slightly. "Easy," he murmured. "Don't use it all at once." The cub made a faint sound, then went still again. Tomas continued walking, slow, steady, because there was no other way to do it. By the time the cabin came into view, the light had shifted again, lower, duller, the kind of light that didn't promise much, just enough to see where you were going, not enough to make it easier. Tomas exhaled slowly. "Almost," he said. The word felt thin in the air, but it held. He reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The difference was immediate. Not warmth, not yet, but less cold, less final. He closed the door behind him and moved toward the fire. The coals still held, faint but alive. "Good," he said. He crouched, feeding in wood, watching as the flame slowly caught. Then he opened his coat, carefully. The cub lay where he had placed it, still, but breathing, still breathing. Tomas nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. "You made it this far." He wrapped the cub in a rough cloth and set it near the fire. Not too close, not too far. Watching, waiting, measuring, because this part decided things, not the finding, not the carrying, what happened next. Tomas sat back slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the small shape beside the fire. The room was quiet. The wind pressed faintly against the walls. The fire cracked softly, and in that stillness, with nothing else demanding his attention, he felt it, the weight of the choice, the one he had already made, the one that would not end cleanly. He exhaled slowly. "They'll say I should have left you," he said. The cub didn't move, didn't respond, didn't need to. Tomas nodded once. "They might be right." A pause, then quieter. "Doesn't change anything. If this part pulled you in, leave a comment and tell me, would you have walked away or done the same?" Tomas did not take his eyes off the cub, not while the fire grew, not while the room slowly shifted from cold to something survivable. He had learned a long time ago that this part mattered more than anything that came before. Not the finding, not the carrying, this, the waiting, the quiet stretch where things either turned or didn't. The cub lay where he had placed it, wrapped in rough cloth, its small body barely disturbing the fabric with each breath. Too slow, too shallow. Tomas leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Come on," he muttered. Not encouragement, not hope, just something to fill the silence. He reached out and adjusted the cloth, pressing it closer around the cub, trapping what little warmth had begun to gather. The fur had started to soften, not frozen solid anymore. That was something, not enough, but something. Time passed, not in minutes, in breaths. Each one counted without being counted. The cub's chest rose, fell, paused longer than Tomas liked, then moved again. Still there, still holding. Tomas exhaled slowly. "You're stubborn," he said. The words came without thought. The cub made a faint sound, barely there, a small shift beneath the cloth. Tomas froze, watched. The movement came again, weak, but real. He nodded once. "All right," he murmured. "That's better." He stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold that hadn't fully left him yet, and crossed to the small shelf near the wall. A bottle, milk, not meant for this, but it would have to do. He poured a small amount into a cup, then moved back to the fire, holding it near the heat, turning it slowly, not too fast. He knew that much. Shock could take what the cold hadn't. Everything about this required restraint, patience, things he had never been particularly good at. When he returned, the cub had shifted slightly within the cloth, its head turned just enough to show it wasn't gone. Not yet. Tomas crouched again, dipped a finger into the warmed milk, then touched it gently to the cub's mouth. At first, nothing, no reaction, no interest. Tomas waited, then tried again. This time, a response, small, instinctive, but there. That's it, he said quietly. Take what you can. He repeated the motion, drop by drop, slow, measured. The cub responded each time a little more, still weak, still uncertain, but trying. That was enough, for now. Tomas sat back again, his hands resting against his legs, his eyes still fixed on the small shape near the fire. The room had warmed slightly, enough that the air no longer bit with every breath. Outside the wind picked up. He could hear it now, pressing against the walls, searching for openings. It always did. Winter didn't stay outside. It waited. It found its way in, one way or another. The cub made another sound, stronger this time, not loud but clearer. Tomas looked at it, really looked, at the small rise and fall, at the way its body had begun to respond again, fighting, without knowing what it was fighting for or why. Tomas's expression shifted slightly, not visible, but something behind it settled. "You're not done yet," he said. A pause. Then, quieter. "Neither am I." But as he sat there with the fire steady and the cub still breathing, something else pressed in. Not from the cold, from the silence, from what wasn't there. He looked toward the door, toward the forest beyond it, toward the absence that didn't make sense. A cub did not end up alone like that. Not in winter, not above ground, not without something happening first. Tomas's jaw tightened. "Where's the mother?" he muttered. The question didn't leave the room. It stayed, hung there, unanswered, heavy. And for the first time since he had picked the cub up from the snow, Tomas felt it, not doubt, something worse, the sense that this wasn't finished, not even close. And whatever had led that cub to him was still out there. Tomas did not sleep. He sat in the chair beside the fire, his body still, his eyes half lowered but never fully closed. The cub remained where he had placed it, breathing, small, fragile, alive. That was enough to keep him there, that and the question that had not left him. It stayed in the room, quiet, persistent. Where was the mother? The fire burned lower as the night deepened. Tomas fed it without thinking, his movement slow, automatic. Years of habit, years of knowing what happened when you let a fire die in weather like this. Across from him, the cub stirred again. Stronger now, not much, but enough to notice. It shifted beneath the cloth, a small movement that broke the stillness just enough to matter. Tomas leaned forward slightly, watched. The cub let out a faint sound, not weak this time, just small. Present. "There you are," he murmured. It wasn't relief. It was acknowledgement. Something had held for now. Then, a sound, not from inside, from outside. Tomas froze. His head turned slightly toward the door. The wind had been steady all night. He knew its rhythm, knew the way it moved against the cabin. This wasn't that. This was different, lower, heavier. A shift in the snow, a presence. Tomas stood slowly, not rushing, not reacting too quickly. He moved toward the door, each step measured, his body already preparing for what it might find. His hand rested on the handle, paused, then opened it. The cold came in immediately, sharp, unforgiving, but Tomas barely felt it, because just beyond the doorway, there were tracks, fresh, large, pressed deep into the snow, not wandering, not searching, direct. They led from the tree line, straight to his door. Tomas's eyes followed them, outward. into the dark. And there, at the edge of the clearing, a shape stood still, watching. The outline was unmistakable, massive, silent. A bear. The mother. Thomas didn't move, didn't speak. The distance between them held, thin, delicate, the kind of space where one wrong decision ended everything. The bear didn't approach, didn't charge, didn't retreat. She stood there, looking past him, into the cabin, toward the fire, toward the small, fragile thing lying just inside. Tomas understood then, not all at once, but enough. She followed, he said quietly, not surprised, just accepting it. The cub made a faint sound behind him, soft, alive. The bear's head shifted slightly, that was all, but it was enough. Thomas exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air between them. "They'd say I should shut this door," he murmured. "They'd say I should keep you out." The bear didn't move, didn't need to. Thomas nodded once. They'd be right. A pause, long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then he stepped back, just one step, and left the door open. The cold poured in, the fire pushed against it, and between the two, something fragile held. The bear did not rush forward, did not cross the threshold. She remained where she was, watching, waiting, not for permission, for certainty. Thomas stood to the side now, no longer blocking the entrance, his hands empty, his posture still. The cub stirred again. Another small sound, stronger than before, and that was what broke the distance. The bear moved, slow, careful, each step placed with quiet control, not a threat, not yet. She reached the doorway, stopped, looked at Thomas once, then past him and stepped inside. The room changed, not in size, not in shape, but in weight, in presence, in something that could not be undone once it entered. Thomas didn't move, didn't interfere. He watched as the bear lowered herself near the fire, near the cub, close enough to feel its breath, close enough to hear it. The cub shifted weakly, responding. Recognizing something beyond instinct, Thomas let out a slow breath, and in that moment, he understood. The cub hadn't refused to leave him, it had held on, because it knew something was still coming. If this part hit you, tell me in the comments, would you have opened that door? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.